Thank you, well done. Thank you very much. You notice I had little issues running a Mac because I haven't really done that many presentations using my Mac. And am I using this? Yes. And until I got infected. And that was, all of us get infected all the time, right? So 2 years ago, a guy who's helping find work in the security business, local guy, hey, Richard, help me get connected to some of these companies. I reach out and I help him a little bit. And then about a month later, right after I'd written about some pharmacy site stuff, I get a link from him, just from his Gmail address. And the only thing in his email is a link, and it leads to a Google document. So I figured, okay, click on it. I could tell it was a pharma site. I thought he was sending it to me because there's some cool new pharma site. Nothing cool about it, other than the fact that after that, my computer started displaying some odd behavior. So, of course, I run, as we all do, all the different anti-malware you got and check it out, and nothing finds anything except my firewall's telling me that I'm beaconing back to China and Russia constantly. And I gave the AV vendors about 3 months to fix it and kept installing their updates, never fixed it. So I got sick of it. Switched to, wiped the machine, switched to Ubuntu, and I'm a happy camper. Until my wife got a Mac, and then I got Mac envy, and now I have a Mac. And I feel so smug that I have a Mac. And before, I never gave up on PCs because I had to live the life of the rest of us in the world, and lived with that. So my talk today is actually not completely countering cyber attacks, which is the topic of a book I'm attempting to complete and get submitted to the publisher. It's so difficult to write a book on something that's moving so quickly. If I let the manuscript sit for a month, I got to start over, which I have, and it's now a month away from being submitted. But a lot of the stuff I've been discovering just this past summer is included in this talk. And just to clear a few things, to me anyways, as a industry analyst, so I cover the 1,500 vendors in the security space. To me, there's a single driver, and that's the threats. And it explains so much about the security industry. Every single time there's an acquisition in this space, the journalist reporting on it says another sign that the industry is consolidating, because, oh my gosh, Symantec bought somebody. Well, Symantec always buys people, and McAfee always buys people, and what is changing on the acquisition side is different companies are getting into security. So you got Dell and Intel buying into security. You got Boeing and a bunch of defense contractors starting to buy into it. But the industry won't consolidate, and it can't consolidate because the driver is change, and the change is the threats. So unlike ERP or CRM or any other industry, eventually it matures. Eventually there's 3 or 4 big players with a leader dominant, and it's usually IBM or Oracle, et cetera. That's not going to happen in the security space. So you have to watch the startups, and you have to watch what's happening out there to understand those threats. I've been using this slide, so I kind of keep it in there to memorialize it, since 2002 when I was at Gartner. And we'd always, first I'd discount all the random attacks because they're no fun, and then I'd talk about targeted attacks because that's where all the exciting stories are. And I'd have this hierarchy of threats, and exploratory hacking is just the kind of thing that we've enabled all of our users and all of our businesses to do because we give them a network browser and the ability, or network explorer, and they can just wander around and look at servers and grab documents. Everybody does exploratory hacking, or at least every environment it occurs. And of course, way back when the New York Times webpage was defaced back in the day, so defacement became the next big thing to worry about, and how you protect your web server, and which was at the time simply a matter of getting off internet or IIS from Microsoft. And of course, hacktivism is still with us and still makes the news, and just getting more and more serious. Even if you account for the attacks on Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase, maybe New York Stock Exchange last week, and certainly PNC Bank this week, these are hacktivist attacks, and there's something to worry about. They certainly cause a lot of pain and agony for the people that are undergoing those attacks. I used to stop here back in 2002, 2003, and I'd say cybercrime, it hasn't happened. I actually struck, use strikeout to cross that out. And obviously, cybercrime is part of our history now, and one of the biggest drivers for the security industry. And certainly when you got to information warfare or cyber warfare or state-sponsored attacks, that was pure hallucinations on the part of guys running around saying the sky is falling because it didn't exist. And of course that changed dramatically in 2008 when Georgia was attacked. They weren't necessarily the Russian military attacking the state of South Ossetia and the government of Georgia. But they certainly were in conjunction with tanks rolling across the border, which was always my definition of cyber war. And I said, what was the requirement? You'd have to have two networked countries bordering each other, and you'd have to have cyber attacks in conjunction with tanks rolling across the border. And it'll be a long time. Think of when I'm saying this in 2002. It'll be a long time before Canada sends tanks across the border into the U.S. Because those were, pretty much only two bordering network countries. Of course, that's changed today, and we do have bordering networked countries, and obviously we have state involvement in cyber attacks. And what are those impacts? Well, for the most part today, they have been intelligence gathering. Intelligence gathering has gone through a lot of cycles over the years, certainly during the Cold War. We had a lot of embedded agents in the Soviet Union and vice versa, and all over the world. It was a really, really big business. And post the dissolution of the Soviet Union, CIA's budget was cut back. It was really dangerous to deploy people, and a lot harder when you've got to train people in Mideastern languages in order to embed them somewhere. So we stepped back from it. Everybody stepped back from it. And why bother training people up in languages and risking their lives and their families, deploying them to be embedded when you can just go over a network and steal stuff? It's so easy, so cheap, might as well just do it. Infiltration comes in a couple different ways, but not just for stealing data, but just having a presence and having a foothold in the adversary or the target's environment, though that actually takes a physical step too, because there are cases of infiltrated agents who are there to assist in cyber espionage. So they're no longer opening up file cabinets late at night and taking pictures with their micro cameras. They are there to get access privileges and put thumb drives into the network and download information. Disruption to services, sabotage, and yes, if you're filling out your bingo cards, yeah, I'm going to mention Stuxnet, and yes, I might even say APT, but sabotage is one of the concerns that we're really kind of waiting for. We know it's possible. We've seen the demos, and obviously we've seen Stuxnet demo how it can be done. And then on the bigger global scene is if the internet is becoming as important as we all believe it is, then it's also a tool or instrument of social change. And certainly the foiled riots after the elections in Iran, the riots in London, it was supposedly fueled by BlackBerry meetup notices, and of course the Arab Spring all have in conjunction with this connection to instantaneous communication that was hard for states to filter or stop. So there's the potential, as we think ahead, of cyber power being part of changing the balance of power, and especially through economic warfare, which ties all the way back to intelligence gathering and intellectual property theft. When I talk about targeted attacks, I have to remind my audiences, especially when I'm talking to large industries, that they might not be the target, they're just the channel. So they are doing a disservice to their trusted partners, customers, if they're not doing as good a job as is possible to prevent these targeted attacks. I've got a banking client in Australia. They're very, very concerned that they could be the channel for attackers to their earth resource companies, all the huge mining companies in Australia, who might target just information about their money flow, or might just want to use that trust relationship they have with the bank to infiltrate their organizations. And a great example from just 2 years ago when the NASDAQ director's desk was infected with, basically drive-by malware was put on the landing page for the director's desk. Well, who uses the director's desk? The press was reporting, oh, NASDAQ's been attacked. No, the boards of directors, the actual members of those boards who use Director's Desk for storing documents. You know, it's kind of a secure Dropbox, probably not very secure in itself, but there you have it. When you visited that, you were getting infected with a drive-by download that was doing usual cyber criminal stuff. So it was probably a cyber criminal attack to get the credentials, the banking credentials of very wealthy people, wealthy and powerful. Maybe it was going a little further because those guys would know a little bit about their M&A activity and could give some very clever cyber criminals ideas on pump and dump schemes. So I first wrote a book on cyber war. I started it August 8th, 2008, after the attacks on South Ossetia in Georgia, because now I could say, hey, tanks rolled across the border, cyber attacks, the era of cyber war is here. I can write a book about it. So as I was doing that, I was at a conference in Dublin at COSAC. Some of you might have been there. If you've never been to COSAC, really, really great experience. 3-day residential conference where you live together and eat together and talk together, and very controversial and confrontational audiences. So if you start saying something they disagree with, man, they'll shut you down. So you have to really be prepared. Not inviting people to do that here, by the way. I suggested to the group, hey, I'm writing a book about cyber warfare. Can anybody suggest to me what a cyber weapon would look like? Because I couldn't think of any other than, DDoS, that's cool, or BGP route announcements to turn a country off, that's cool. But what about an actual weapon, right? So nobody said anything in the public meeting, but at dinner that night, a guy from Switzerland nudges me and he says, I got one for you, software updates. It's a totally trusted channel from a vendor to their customers for getting into their networks and changing software on their desktops. Even if you had whitelisting, you're going to allow an update from Adobe or Microsoft. Sure, the best organizations test updates, and they do so in a test environment, make sure it doesn't break any applications, but nobody does code analysis on an update. They're not sending you the source code. You'd have to do it on the binaries, and nobody's fuzzing it. You wouldn't know if the update had installed a new vulnerability on purpose. And how in the world would you attack an update service? And from Microsoft, McAfee, of course, your antivirus vendors sending you updates every day. And sure enough, we're starting to see that. The first inkling we got was when the Komodo hacker infiltrated a certificate authority in Europe and then started issuing, signed certificates for all these different vendors and websites. Pretty cool demo, and at the time he claimed that he was doing it kind of in support of, or he was somebody who supported the regime in Iran. And then later on we see that he claims credit for attacking DigiNotar and getting their signing certificate and signing over 250 certificates for Microsoft and Google and most of the major vendors and websites. And those certificates then used in Iran to be a man-in-the-middle, basically, attack against Iranian citizens who are using Gmail. And you'll note that Iran is actually shutting off access to Google. They've shut off access to Google this week, as well as Gmail, and they're getting ready to basically create an iron curtain around Iran and have their own internet internally. So good luck with that, Iran. That'll be by March, they say. And all of this because they're under such attack, they claim. But obviously, they're controlling their end users. So here we have a guy who says he sympathizes with Iran, basically handing over the keys to the kingdom with stolen signing certificates from DigiNotar, and posting a pay spin that he had completely reverse engineered the Microsoft update service, and he said he could hack it. We didn't see him do that, but that's okay because the NSA has done that. The NSA figured out how Microsoft updates work, and they incorporated in Flame a false Microsoft certificate for update. So they just went to their targets in the Middle East and said, hey, here's an update, please accept it. The update had malware in it. It was signed with a digital certificate that was made through an MD5 hash collision, which we all know is not easy to do. It was theoretically demonstrated how you would do it, but the costs were so high that people weren't doing it. $200,000 on Amazon EC2 compute time to do an average MD5 collision attack. Well, somebody with the resources to do that did that. Adobe announced yesterday that somebody was infiltrating them and did the code signing on their products. Perfect. There you go. Predictions come true. Real time. But let's take us back to Athens in 2004. So you remember the Summer Olympics, and this popped up in the news. Of course, it was pretty big news to me, so I paid particular attention. As Vodafone Greece's Ericsson switch was basically hacked in a very, very clever way. Over a period of several months, several software updates were installed, and they were installing just segments of new code until the final update was installed, and its only purpose was to turn on lawful intercept and give some outsiders access to that lawful intercept and redirect phone calls over the cell phone network to whoever wanted to listen. We don't know who it was. The investigation was cut very, very short, only re-engaged last January. So maybe eventually we'll get news out of what happened. The reason it actually hit the news was that the engineer who was responsible for this Ericsson switch was found hung in his apartment, so dead from who knows what, maybe just remorse for doing that. And it also turns out that the Ericsson switch software is all developed in Athens. So they just had this confluence of, we had the experts there, they had an insider evidently, and of course, you know, where there's sporting, there's betting, there's going to be organized crime. And it certainly has all the hallmarks of that. But a great example of how software updates can be used. So I don't know if anybody else this week has talked about Stuxnet, but just a couple points. So, you know, remember Stuxnet, probably USB born. We definitely know it was targeting the uranium centrifuges in Natanz. Targeted Siemens software, used 4 zero-day vulnerabilities. So that alone is expensive, right? Those are valuable things if you got them. Very expensive to discover them yourself. Use the vulnerabilities to find the workstations that were running step 7. Once they found them, they install a DLL rootkit that would just sit there and pass everything through to the regular DLL until it saw a particular format, a particular block of data, and then it would modify them to actually change the speed at which the centrifuges were going. One interesting thing about Stuxnet was its size. Everybody was marveling at how big this piece of software was. I'll get back to that actually on my last slide, but keep that in mind. Stuxnet was very, very large. Stuxnet was very successful. It actually succeeded in its goal of slowing down Iran's ability to refine uranium into maybe weapons-grade uranium. We are at 130 days and counting since one of the most important events, I think game-changing, and for me, a demarcation point in the history of cyber, if we want to call it that. I actually have something. So I'm not the kind of guy who saves newspapers. As a matter of fact, in the bottom of a file cabinet, I've got the only other newspaper I've ever saved, and that was from when Apollo 13 was stranded in space, and it was a really cool article. But I have saved this one, the New York Times of June 1st, 2012, when Paul Sanger basically reveals that the Obama administration was the guys behind Stuxnet and Flame. So, and probably, according to Kaspersky Labs and reports from the Washington Post, probably Dooku and Gauss as well. All of a sudden, a super secret program is totally revealed by the guys who evidently wrote it. You gotta, of course, whenever you're dealing with intelligence matters, you gotta step back and say, okay, is it true? Did the US really write it? Or did they just pull the wool over, you know, this award-winning journalist in the New York Times? Take it on face value. He provided enough corroborating evidence, stories from White House insiders who say the Situation Room conference table, which we all know because we watched West Wing, was littered with parts from destroyed centrifuges from Idaho National Labs where they'd done the tests. It was so secret they had spread the tests out over multiple research labs so the guys in the labs wouldn't know exactly what was going on, though I'm sure they suspected after they heard about Stuxnet. The repercussions from not only demonstrating Stuxnet in the first place. Hey, you can use these attacks to do physical damage, but then to come back and claim credit for it, as the US government has in their usual surreptitious way. You know, they leaked the information and the FBI is investigating the leak, but notice that they haven't subpoenaed anybody and there's been no action on it because it came from the executive office. So what's the point in thumbing your nose at Iran like that, which they obviously have? In my mind, and mind you, in all my writing, all my books, I've never said, oh my God, Cybergeddon is coming, the end of the world is coming, but I now feel convinced that it would be really, really logical and certainly within the realm of the definitions of the laws of war for Iran to retaliate against an attributed source with, you know, a measured response, which is the terminology they use, right? So taking out a building with an airplane would not be a measured response, but certainly attacking a control system in the West or the United States would be a measured response. So why should the enterprise care? Because obviously, unless we're from the government, none of us, or critical infrastructure, most of us aren't involved in these types of things. But if Google, the Pentagon, so Google Aurora, the Pentagon attacks against that own their email servers for an undetermined amount of time, at least 6 months in 2007. The attacks against Rio Tinto, a large mining organization in Australia that basically owned them. The attacks against Sony that owned them. The attacks against RSA. RSA is another great example of them not being the target. So you know, it was China, according to General Keith Alexander. China attacked RSA. China stole the secure ID seeds. They didn't just want the secure ID seeds, they were after Lockheed, and they attempted to use those within 2 weeks to get into Lockheed. So if they can be breached, how can the enterprise first defend themselves? But most of them that I talk to are saying, well, we're not Google, we're not the Pentagon, we're not Rio Tinto. You know, we're a medical facility in Grand Rapids. Why should we care? So there are some reasons that you should care. The retaliation risk. So if Iran attacks, or any other organization that takes it into their mind, decides to use Stuxnet-like attacks against our critical infrastructure, our control systems, there will be an impact on your business. Not one that you can do anything about in the first place, but you maybe want to look at your power backup systems and get yourself a nice big diesel generator for power supply. And then individually, you might want to worry about water. I'm shocked to discover that especially people inside Washington, D.C. are hoarding cash, physical cash, in their houses because they're all kind of thinking something could happen. There's the risk from collateral damage, and not the traditional collateral damage or even the collateral damage that the U.S. faced during these attacks on Georgia in 2008. So you probably heard the story. There was a hosting provider in Atlanta, Georgia. It gets a little confusing, state versus country. But she happened to be in the capital of Georgia, the country, when the attacks were occurring. And you know, they're basically DDoS attacks and people taking out the pipes into Georgia coming from Turkey. She said, hey, I got a great idea. Just reset your DNS to point to us at our hosting provider in Atlanta, Georgia, the state. Well, they did that, and they got 60,000 page requests a second to that website in their hosting environment, and took out all of their several thousand customers' ability to serve up web pages. So that was an example of collateral damage. But what I'm worried about is, for instance, a case that it seems to be fairly probable as Israel is, you know, clashing their spears and kind of getting the world ready for a preemptive attack against Iran's nuclear capability. A document was leaked out of the Israeli cabinet that states very clearly in the first paragraph that any such attack would be preceded by what, you know, they use the word massive cyber attack against Iran's infrastructure. And if so, it would be targeting their communications and their power and their electrical and their water facilities. In order to do a massive attack, you got to have a lot of release points, and you got to get it out there quickly, and you might not have enough time to do the testing to make sure that it stays in Iran. In other words, there will be collateral fallout from that, cyber fallout, I guess you could call it. That's probably not on your bingo cards, but you can add it in. And if so, we could have concerns for ourselves when that happens. And of course, the adaptation by cyber criminals, and yes, we are seeing Stuxnet code reused for attacks for cyber criminals. So there's 3 areas of concern if you're the enterprise. So in my travels, especially this summer, I've actually, I've been talking about reorganizing for cyber defense now for a year and a half, and I'm actually encountering organizations that were way ahead of me, have already done this. They're looking at me like, hey, where were you? We've been doing this for years, only because they've been on the pointy end of the stick. They've seen these attacks and their traditional IT operations that we're handling, patching and vulnerability testing and pen testing and antivirus and monitoring your IDS logs. Not enough, not working. They have to do something else. In 1995, the term CISO was coined by Citigroup. So that was the very first Chief Information Security Officer was Steve Katz. And of course, the US government has assigned a cyber commander. And I see in the news today that one of the top intel guy in the U.S. Cyber Command is saying we need a lot more resources. We're going to expand U.S. Cyber Command. It was already pretty dang big. It's getting bigger. I'm a big proponent of assigning responsibility, and that's exactly what Citigroup did. I remember meeting with John Thomas, the CEO of Symantec at the time. His first day on the job, he went home, and all of a sudden he got a call that they've just had this massive attack, and their systems are down, and the viruses are running all over the place, and he said, well, who's in charge of security? There wasn't anybody at Symantec in charge of security in 2002. That was on a weekend. By Monday morning, there was a CISO at Symantec. You have to assign responsibility. This is going to be the person whose job depends on preventing targeted attacks. And I call that the cyber commander. You can call it the director of your SOC, or you could just take the whole team that currently is labeled the computer emergency response team and fold them into this operation. But they've got some new responsibilities. So the cyber commander, obviously, he's the one throat to choke. He's the guy who's going to lose his job if a major breach occurs that he should have prevented. But he's also going to assure that the right tools and the budgets are in place. And importantly, he's going to report up in the organization on a regular basis about the situational awareness, exactly where they stand, and communicate outward to law enforcement when needed. Because that's everybody I've talked to who's gone through this breach, it's one of the parts that they've never practiced or never established those relationships. Who do you call when something like this is going on? I think the analysts are probably the newest part. So every IT organization has security guys that are, going to conferences like this quite often on their own time and on their own dime, and they're reading a lot of stuff, but it's not managed and it's not really their primary responsibility. About 2 years ago, I started scratching my head because I monitor, as a lot of analysts do, the job posting boards just to see what companies are doing and who they're looking for. If they're posting jobs, they're probably growing. And I started to see reverse engineers requirements at major banks. And I'm going, well, why would a bank want to hire these highly specialized technologists at very big price tags to do reverse engineering when Symantec and McAfee and the Webroots of the world have hired all those guys already? They're already employed. Why would anybody go to a bank, and why would the bank need that? Well, it turns out they're being targeted. Nobody else has ever seen this code. Symantec isn't going to take code submissions from anybody. They've already got 50,000 samples a day. They don't need any more, and they're not concerned about yours because it's not in the wild. It's not going to attack anybody else. So there's no benefit to them to write a signature for your code. So the cyber analysts are doing that full time. They're also creating the methodologies for detecting these attacks, and they are actually I had it described at one defense contractor I went to. They're puzzle solvers. They're really smart people. They love to solve puzzles. They're not necessarily, the best reverse engineers in the world. They hire those as well, but they have to have these guys that are figuring out what's going on, and they have to figure out what the target is, as well as classify the methodologies used. They call them key indicators, so they can build them into something called campaigns. And this is the best example I've seen of how to get upper management and the board to get really engaged in security. They present to upper management the campaigns that they've seen that are attacking them. A campaign is defined by these common indicators. That could be, of course, the source IP address, the type of malware that's being used, or the actual source code of the malware that's being used, the source email addresses, the domains, the targets, if they're individual key employees of the organization that are being targeted. All that bundles up into, hey, this is campaign, sticky fingers. They just add a name to it, so they have a name. And then they roll that up and highlight it to upper management. They look at, we've got 6 campaigns, and we've killed them, stopped them along the way. And wow, we ran out of a few resources, or need more resources, because look how far this campaign got. And then they got all the way to the Active Directory server, or they were actually installed on the email server before we discovered them and shut them down. So the analysts will use tools like Palantir. If you've never seen Palantir, it's an analyst notebook. It's just a way of linking information. It's kind of a brain tree kind of display. And it's used, it's a very, very successful company. They've gone kind of underground after LulzSec exposed them as being part of the HB Gary hack that they did. But Palantir is doing extremely well. Several hundred employees already based in Palo Alto. And this cool tool that they have allows you to link stuff, and they sell to the intelligence organizations who are tracking threat actors. And the guys at SecDev, the Monk Institute in Toronto, were the first to demonstrate how you'd use it for a cyber investigation. When they're investigating the attacks, the successful infiltration of the Dalai Lama's office, they use Palantir to tie it all together. So you can keep track of all those IP addresses and ports and actors. So you'll see these tools being used a lot. And then you got the operations guys. So they're selecting the actual tools that are going to be used to defend the organization. They're going to be discovering these internal infections from these targeted attacks, and they're going to be monitoring insider behavior, because the insiders, looks like it's your employee acting, but it's obviously just somebody with their credentials and their computer that are acting. They might use tools like this one from SecAlert to alert them to the beaconing that's going on between internal machines and command and control servers. So SecAlert's an Israeli company that's clued into this opportunity, and another one is Unveillance. So Unveillance is based out of Atlanta. They got a little, maybe $1.5 million in financing, and 6 or 7 guys working on it. But in their investigation, so what they do basically is they tear apart, they got sandboxes and honey nets, and they grab 30,000 samples of malware every day, run it in a sandbox, see where it attempts to connect to. Those IP addresses are IP addresses of interest, and then they put them in their database. And then they use either DNS sinkholing. I suspect nobody will admit that they actually hack into the command and control servers and install their own malware agents on those, and then monitor all of the IP addresses that are signaling back to home base. And now they've got a list of all IP addresses that are infected by malware. And then they just do a few pivots on that table. They claim 90% of Fortune 1000 are infected with these botnets. They're not, botnets. They're not necessarily China or Russia hacking in, but there's certainly cyber criminals hacking in. And then they'll give you these great displays by country. They did a live display for me. They said, well, let me just show you the .gov domain and all the infections. And on that day, there were 3,800 infected machines with these bots around the United States, including one way out in the ocean, which must have been Hawaii. But imagine, it could be really hard to sell this product because you're really embarrassing the CISO when you show him that he's got infections that he didn't even know about, but a really good way to sell the defensive tools around it. So they can take it by botnet and show you all the infection sources, and then they can drill in to location, and it's hard to see here, but they're actually showing you the infection date, so the first time and then signaled back to the command and control server, and the last time that they got a signal from it. So really, really good intelligence on what's inside the network. And companies that provide the types of tools to block that access, they can take a feed of known bad IP addresses and then block access to them. NetWitness, easily the industry leader, acquired by RSA after RSA's breach, mind you. Damballa is something like that, though they focus a lot on DNS entries. Solera is essentially a network flight recorder that's recording all information, but you're able to drill down into it and look for those IP addresses. Guidance does that on the endpoint. And Trend Microsystems is rolling out this really cool set of products that are basically your own sandbox. So you can have a sandbox in the wire, similar to a FireEye, where they're tearing apart the code as it comes in, or you can have a sandbox server, and you can you basically put the plumbing in place to connect everything to it. So all your email servers send suspicious samples to it, figure out what it is. They can tell you those destination IP addresses, as a matter of fact. And finally, you've got the red team. So this is different from your attack and penetration team. You either outsource to your PwCs of the world or the guys you use internally. These guys are looking at the projects and the products that you are rolling out, and they're looking at your business processes. And they do something I call business process hacking, something that usually only an insider would be aware of. The kind of stuff when I was at PwC that we'd do, we'd go on site, and after 3 or 4 days, either we discovered or the inside IT administrators just told us about some of the vulnerabilities in their systems because they're so frustrated nobody does anything about them. They know that when PwC says do something about it, they'll do it. But that's when you discover how the business works and how you can subjugate that business to make money or disturb the business. And this is what the real internal red team should do. I've seen a bank do this against the SWIFT payment network. They quickly discovered that SWIFT terminals are used for wire transfers everywhere in the world except Michigan. I'm just going to pick on Michigan because I cannot transfer money over SWIFT for some reason. Maybe a good thing because the SWIFT terminals are client-side authentication. So all you have to do is send the correct packets to the IBM MQ series server that says you're authenticated, and you are authenticated. These guys managed to transfer $1 million into their own account in 1 day of attack. And then if you haven't been exposed to this, I highly recommend you download Lockheed Martin's white paper on the cyber kill chain. I'm loving this. I know it's buzzwords, but I'm loving this as a methodology to help you switch from the thing I like to criticize a lot, which is risk-based management. I'm not a big proponent of finding all your assets, classifying all the assets as critical, not critical. Why do we even have this here? It's like what IT guy is going to say, hey, my asset's not critical, so fire me and get rid of the asset. Doesn't happen. Risk management is almost impossible to accomplish. Threat-based management is possible because you're fighting an adversary. This is how Lockheed Martin is looking at it. So they'll take what we think of as a traditional anatomy of an attack. We used to call it footprint analysis first. They call it reconnaissance. And the reconnaissance is getting very, very sophisticated, as we saw in the Google Aurora attacks, where the reconnaissance included figuring out key employees that probably have access credentials to the stuff that they wanted, which was access to people's Gmail accounts. They just stumbled across the source code and stole all of Google's source code as a benefit. But the reconnaissance included finding the friends of those people on Facebook and then friending them and eventually infecting the friends of friends with malware that would post links to Facebook, which the guys at Google would click on and get in the door that way. But other reconnaissance is, hey, we've identified this key individual, we've got his LinkedIn profile, we're following him on Twitter, and he's attending GrrCON in Grand Rapids, so let's send him, some document about the event, and of course, we're going to weaponize that document that we send them, and that's the next stage, is the weaponization. And the weaponization is that deciding who you're going to target, what email domain you're going to use, if you're going to do it from inside, and using Metasploit or whatever toolkit to bundle the exploit with some innocuous document. The delivery is sending it by email, USB token, getting somebody a link on a page. The exploitation opens up the machine, drops the remote access Trojan, and then starts communicating with the command and control server to install the rest of the components. And finally, the actions on objectives, so the actual exfiltration of the information they want, or changing credentials in the Active Directory server, stealing all the credentials for the encryption that are just there in clear text in the Active Directory server, any of that good stuff, actions on objectives. Each of those steps in the attack methodology, they call it the cyber kill chain, is an opportunity to deploy one of the 6 Ds, which I'm not a military guy, so I still have to read them: detect, deny, disrupt, degrade, deceive, or destroy. And obviously detection is, there are a lot of tools that you can have to help you detect each step of the way, and most people don't actually monitor their web logs to see when they're being scanned or reconnoitered, or if there's some suspicious behavior. You know, before a DDoS attack, somebody's got to figure out which one of your web pages causes the most stress on the back end database, the SQL server on the back end. So they're going to go through all your pages, not following the same logical order of clicking, you know, down the tree, finding information, but they're going to go, hey, wow, that generates a map. That makes a call to the database server and creates, you know, a special shopping cart page. They're going to look for those pages and identify those to load into LOIC or whatever attack tool they have. So you might get some forewarning. Now, mind you, PNC Bank could have gotten forewarning by reading Pastebin and the news articles about it. But watching your web stuff can be valuable. And then you get to deny the attacks. You know, maybe if they're dumb enough not to use proxies, you actually know the IP address that they're going to attack from. Who knows? Or you can put ACLs in the routers and switches. All these tools can be deployed to stop each step of the way, and this is exactly how they create their campaigns and reporting on how they've stopped campaigns. So that's the cyber kill chain, and that's as far as I've got in my investigations of what people are doing in order to reorganize to counter targeted attacks. You'll note that the cyber kill chain is APTs, right? These are exactly how RSA's attack, Lockheed's attack. They all see this. It always follows the same format, which of course means that they'll assume me another format. And remember I said, you know, how the notable thing about Stuxnet was how big it was? Well, there wasn't the normal command and control communication with Stuxnet. Evidently there was a command and control server for Flame, and evidently they did get feedback from Stuxnet on its progress. We don't know how they did that. It's got to be fairly sophisticated. They could have had an embedded agent, but Stuxnet was so big because it had to run autonomously. And that was the definition for me of a true cyber weapon, is once it's installed, it does what it has to do. And so it's going to be expensive to develop. You don't get this opportunity to take it a step at a time. Get an infected machine, you know, cast your net widely. You only catch 2 guys, work with that. You've got to design something, you know, just like a remote satellite going to Mars. It's got to work without hands-on control. The attackers will continuously upgrade their methodologies. The cyber kill chain is a published paper. Why not step around it somehow? The defenders must continue to upgrade as well. I think we have time for a couple questions if anybody wants to shout them out, I guess. No microphones? And my contact details if you want to get a hold of me. Nobody yelled bingo. I must have missed something. I know, it's the last event. I'm going to make you sit in your chair. No, go ahead. Yeah, so the question was, you know, pondering why Bank of America's and PNC's still getting successfully attacked after all this expertise is represented in the room and in each of these organizations. Unfortunately, you know, we're still at that stage where the blinders are on, and everybody here has experienced, you know, hey, I need to be able to do this, and I need either more people or more technology, something, and being told, no, you know, we just gave you all this money for your DLP solution. You know, we don't believe you anymore because we haven't been attacked. And we're still fighting that. You know, my frustration is, you know, why don't they just read my blog? I will tell them what's going to happen to them. If they just read it and reacted, but of course, there are lots of people like me doing the exact same thing. And I'm just used to it. I've got full-time employment. I'll just keep, but I've stopped telling people to patch. I learned my lesson a long time ago. It's like, that's not possible, so shut up about it. But, you know, you can do the, you know, DDoS defense. That's one thing, you know, when I talk to, I have two perplexing vendor segments. The DDoS defense guys, so, you know, Arbor and Prolexic on the service side, and GrrCON on the appliance side as well. And they're like, hey, everyone is a potential target, so everyone should be a customer, and they're not. You know, very, very low revenue relative to the rest of the industry. The other is vulnerability management. This is like, come on, everybody should be doing vulnerability management. Everybody should know today what their vulnerabilities are. You know, it doesn't help you against the 0 days at all, but at least you should be doing it. And the VM vendors are telling me that 90% of the calls they make, the guys have never heard of vulnerability management. So it's like the attack surface area. The number of organizations are so large, there will always be a vulnerable target. And if it's not Bank of America today, it'll be some bank we haven't even heard of. Cool. The question is, what about federated information sources? So for banks to work together or government to work with banks. So there's progress. Inside the financial services, what's it called, ISET, the information sharing associations that the government set up for so far 16 of the critical information infrastructure guys. They are attempting to share information. Unfortunately, every place the government sits, they're classifying all the information. So the sources of attacks are classified. So at this point, it's all one way, sharing with the government. The financial services group is by far the best. They're sharing real information. But one defense contractor I went to, who works in the defense industrial base, right? And the defense industrial base has their own information sharing group amongst 30 of them. They share sources of attack and these critical indicators all the time. The one I talked to showed a pie chart without numbers on it because they thought it was pretty critical not to share that. But it looked like about 80% of the attacks that they felt that they had stopped came from internal information only, and 20% from external information. So the attacks are so targeted that sharing isn't necessarily working all the time. And that's, you know, and there's a bunch of organizations that are attempting to, one, make that sharing standardized like CV is for vulnerabilities, and hopefully be able to get some sort of XML feed to everybody else. I believe the progress is going to come from the vendors. So I'm kind of thinking Trend Micro because I was just at their 2-day analyst event. And they do that amongst their customers, just like you do with, I mean, the only way to do URL content filtering today is not web crawling, right? And trying to find every website in the world and classify it. You just wait until one of your customers, if you have a big install base. So of course, Trend has, you know, 20 million endpoints or something like that. Fortinet has 1 million gateway devices deployed. Those are all reporting. Every time they see a new URL, they report it back for analysis. They got automated analysis, and then human analysts in China determining what that is and then feeding it back. And it's going to be the vendors that solve this problem because they're going to sell you tools that have all the indicators from all of their enrolled customers. And Trend's got tools that do that now. They got 600 enrolled customers. 80% of them have agreed to let their information out. The government guys generally will say no, because that information is classified, because just knowing who the attackers are could be some information the attackers use, I don't know. So there is hope, but I don't believe it's going to come from the government organizing voluntary systems as the Cybersecurity Act of 2012 was supposed to do. And the executive order soon to be released will, and it ain't going to work. Yes, sir. great question. What is the advantage to the U.S. for leaking the fact that they're responsible for Stuxnet? For some reason, I just stepped back. It was only a couple weeks ago, and I said, what could be the reasons for that? I came up with 3. I ran them past Marcus Random because I know he'll tell me something bullshit if it's bullshit, and he said they're all bullshit. But the 3 were, first of all, the one that's been voiced in the press. You know, it's just a politics move to improve the president's, the perception of the president as a great leader, right? Maybe. Another one I thought is, okay, you couldn't make that claim if it weren't true, right? Because the real guys would go, ha ha, and the intelligence community, the spy world, would know that you were lying. So you really wouldn't want to do that unless Israel were behind it and the US was taking the heat for Israel. So that's another, just throwing it out there, no idea. And thirdly, now this is the tinfoil hat conspiracy theory version. There is a movement for regulating our critical infrastructure. So there's this evident desire to impose a whole bunch of cyber regulations on oil and gas, electrical grid, all the rest. Well, we all know, Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So we actually need a cyber Katrina in order for the government to react. We need a 9/11 in order for the Patriot Act to be passed. So after the attack against critical infrastructure, then they'll be able to instantly get everybody in Congress voting for some sort of cyber regulation that will be really onerous and, of course, totally useless and not effective, but they'll have what they want, which is another regulatory regime that costs a lot of money and a lot of lobbying and all the rest. So how to induce that? Thumb your nose at Iran. Not only did you really hurt them and really embarrass them in the spy world, now you've just taken it to the international stage, and of course the street gets access to the papers, through proxy servers, so they know it too, so you've really, really embarrassed them. They force them to do something about it, and that something would be a physical attack. My 3 theories, I don't know. Thank you. All right, you're excused. I'll be up here.